The Ark Raiders maps are hiding 171 Easter eggs, developer secrets, and buried lore details that most players have never once stopped long enough to notice. And tonight this video is going to walk you through every single one of them. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So I've been going through the Ark Raiders maps for a long time now, and the thing that kept pulling me back wasn't the combat, wasn't the loot, it was the feeling that there was more written into these spaces than most people ever get to read. I'm the creator and editor of this video, and when I started pulling these details together, I made one specific choice that shaped the whole thing. I decided to organize everything in a loose timeline, starting from before the Ark machines arrived, moving through the invasion itself, and ending with the world as Raiders move through it today. Some of these Easter eggs slot neatly into that order. Others I had to make judgment calls about. I also made the choice to lean heavily into environmental storytelling over combat mechanics, because the Easter eggs I found most interesting were the ones that suggested human lives, not just human deaths. Everything I say here is interpretation, not gospel. With that said, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The City That Wouldn't Die. Easter eggs 1 through 15. The first thing you notice when you drop into any Ark Raiders urban map is that these cities did not go quietly. There are signs of resistance everywhere, not just in the obvious barricades and abandoned weapons, but in the small details, the things someone took time to do even when everything was falling apart. That's what the first 15 Easter eggs on this list are about. They're scattered across the city districts, and together they point toward a population that held on far longer than the game's surface aesthetic might suggest. What makes these details interesting isn't any one of them in isolation. It's the accumulation of them, the way they stack up into a picture of a community that kept functioning, kept organizing, kept communicating, right up until the point where it couldn't anymore. Easter egg number 1 is easy to miss because it blends into the general visual noise of the environment. Along one of the main city thoroughfares, there's a bus stop that still has a schedule posted inside the glass panel. The schedule shows times and routes, none of which are remarkable on their own. But if you look at the date printed at the bottom of the schedule, it reads as a reissue date, suggesting the schedule was reprinted and updated after the city had already been partially evacuated. The bus service was still running, someone was still printing schedules. That's a specific kind of stubborn optimism that this game doesn't spell out for you. You just have to look at the date and think about what it means. The second Easter egg builds on the first in an interesting way. Near that same bus stop, or in the general cluster of streets around it, depending on your server instance and which version of the map you're on, there's a pile of bags and personal belongings stacked against a wall. Most players run past this assuming it's generic environmental clutter, but if you crouch down and look at the individual items, you can see that the bags are organized. They're not scattered the way they would be if someone dropped them in a panic. They're stacked by size with smaller bags on top, almost as if someone intended to come back and collect them in an orderly fashion. This suggests, at least to me, that the person who left these bags expected the situation to be temporary. They weren't fleeing permanently. They were waiting out what they thought was going to be a short disruption. Easter egg number 3 is one of my favourites in this whole video because it's so specific. On the exterior wall of what appears to be a community centre or a school, there's a mural. Large murals are common in these environments, and most of them are clearly pre-invasion artwork, just part of the urban decoration. This particular mural, though, has something added to it that wasn't part of the original design. In the lower right corner of the mural, someone has painted a small arrow pointing upward, and next to the arrow, in a completely different art style, the word still. Just the word still. No context, no sentence. It points toward one reading where someone was responding to the mural, which depicts a hopeful or forward-looking scene, by annotating it with their own message. still, as in still true, or still here, or still trying. The ambiguity is what makes it work. The fourth Easter egg is structural rather than visual. There's a building in the city district that has its ground floor windows bricked up from the inside. This in itself isn't unusual. Fortification was common, but if you look at the brickwork carefully, you can see two distinct phases of construction. The first phase uses full bricks, consistent in colour and placement. The second phase, which fills a gap left in the first phase, uses broken bricks and irregular material, including what looks like pieces of tile and ceramic. This suggests the original fortification was planned and deliberate, but at some point the builders ran out of proper materials and had to improvise. The gap they were filling is roughly the size and shape of a door. At some point someone sealed themselves in, or sealed something else out. Easter egg 5 is audio-based, which makes it harder to notice if you're playing with a lot of ambient combat noise in the mix. In a particular alleyway, if you stop moving and just stand still for a few seconds, you can hear what sounds like a radio signal cycling. It repeats at irregular intervals. It doesn't sound like a malfunctioning arc machine. The pattern is too deliberate for random interference. It's possible this is just ambient sound design with no specific intent behind it. But the cycling pattern, if you listen long enough, seems to repeat in groups of 3 short pulses, followed by 1 long one. That particular rhythm doesn't match any arc machine communication pattern documented in other parts of the game's audio. It points towards something else, possibly human in origin. The 6th Easter egg is a small plaque mounted on the wall of what might have been a pharmacy or a small medical supply store. The plaque reads like a business award, the kind a small business might receive from a local chamber of commerce. The business name on the plaque is Harlow & Daughters, established 2041. What's notable about this is the year. If you cross-reference the loose timeline the game suggests for when the arc machines arrived, 2041 is very recent. This business was established, or at least received this award, close to or possibly during the early stages of the invasion. Someone started a business during a catastrophe. Or this was a normal year, and the catastrophe came later. Either reading changes how you think about the world's timeline. Easter egg 7 is one of the larger environmental details in this chapter, and it requires you to get above street level to notice it properly. If you climb to a rooftop in the city district and look down at the street layout, you can see that someone has arranged large pieces of debris, broken concrete blocks, and twisted metal to form an arrow pattern pointing toward a specific direction. From street level, this looks like random debris scatter. From above, it's clearly intentional. The direction the arrow points leads toward what the map marks as a collapsed overpass. Whether this was a marker for survivors trying to navigate, or a warning pointing away from something, or a signal intended to be seen from above by something other than a human, is genuinely unclear. All 3 readings seem possible. The 8th Easter egg in this chapter involves a very specific piece of graffiti that appears in multiple locations across the city district. It's not a tag or an artistic piece. It's a simple symbol, a circle with a horizontal line through the middle and a short vertical line extending downward from the circle. This symbol doesn't match any arc machine iconography documented in the game's observable technology. It also doesn't appear to match any known faction logo or organizational marker. It appears in at least 4 locations across the district, always at roughly chest height, always on a surface that would be easy to see when walking a specific route through the city. One possible reading is that it's a waymarking system used by survivors or resistance fighters. Another reading is that it was placed after the fact by someone mapping or cataloguing what was left behind. Easter egg 9 is subtle enough that I almost didn't include it in this category. It's a newspaper, or what remains of one, pinned under a piece of debris near what looks like a former newsstand. Most of the text is illegible, But the headline is partially visible, and what you can read of it suggests the story was about logistics, specifically about supply chain disruptions in some industrial or manufacturing context. This is the kind of mundane headline that might feel like pure world-building decoration. But the specific nature of the story, logistics and supply chains, rather than something dramatic, points toward a world where the invasion or the threat of it was already being felt in practical economic ways before everything collapsed. The boring news was still the news right up until it wasn't. The 10th Easter egg is easy to find once you know what you're looking for. On a stretch of fencing near what appears to be a former construction site, there are small folded pieces of paper attached to the chain links at regular intervals. They're fragile-looking, weather-damaged, easy to overlook as debris, but if you approach them you can see that each one is a handwritten note. The text is too small and degraded to read in full, but the format suggests these are personal messages. Contact information, perhaps, or meeting points. Someone converted this fence into a message board, a low-tech community bulletin system in a situation where digital communication was no longer reliable. Whether anyone ever came back to read these notes is a question the game doesn't answer. Easter egg 11 is a detail embedded in the city's street art that rewards careful attention. One of the larger murals in the district depicts what looks like an abstract landscape, blue and grey shapes suggesting sky and earth. It's modernist in style, the kind of thing that would have been painted on a commission years before the invasion. But someone has added a single detail to the upper portion of the mural, a small figure, no bigger than a fist, silhouetted against the painted sky. The figure is painted in a darker shade than the original mural, clearly added after. It's standing, arms at its sides, looking up, not running, not falling, just standing and looking up. At what, the mural doesn't say. Easter egg 12 sits in an area of the map that most players move through quickly because it's not particularly rich in loot. There's a small courtyard between two collapsed buildings, and in the courtyard there's a table that still has chairs around it. On the table there are cups, mostly knocked over, and a centerpiece that seems to be a vase with dried flowers. This alone would read as set dressing, but if you look at the chairs, you'll notice that one of them has been pushed back from the table in a way that's inconsistent with the rest. The other chairs are either upright at the table or knocked over. This one chair is pushed back at an angle, the way you'd push a chair back if you stood up in a hurry. Someone was sitting at this table and got up suddenly. The flowers suggest this was a regular gathering spot. The pushback chair suggests the last gathering ended fast. Easter egg 13 is one that I find genuinely unsettling in the best way. In a corridor between two structures, there's a set of markings on the floor. At first they look like scuffs or damage, but they're regular, circular patterns arranged in a loose grid. They look like the marks left by chair legs, or by something being dragged repeatedly along the same path. The pattern is too regular to be accidental, and the spacing suggests whatever made these marks was either being moved on a schedule or was moving itself on a schedule. If you look at the wall above the marks, there's a faded line at roughly the same height as an adult human shoulder. Whatever was moving through here was about that tall. It doesn't match arc machine proportions documented elsewhere in the game. Easter egg 14 is a small detail in an otherwise unremarkable room that functions as a former office. Desks, overturned furniture, scattered papers, the usual. But on one of the desks, among the scattered papers, there's a calendar. The calendar is open to a specific month, and on that month, several dates are crossed out in sequence up until a certain point, and then the crossing out stops. The last day crossed out is not the last day of the month, it's mid-month. After that date, no more marks. This is the kind of detail that becomes significant only in context. Someone was keeping track of days, and then they stopped. Whether they stopped because they left, because they found a more reliable way to track time, or because they stopped needing to, is a question the calendar can't answer. Easter egg 15 closes out this chapter, and it's the one that took me the longest to notice. If you look at the city from a specific elevated vantage point, one that most players would only reach if they were specifically exploring rather than running a route, you can see that the arrangement of certain large structural elements, collapsed walls, toppled pylons, pieces of overpass, forms a rough shape when viewed from above. I want to be careful here because this kind of large-scale pattern recognition is where interpretation can easily tip into projection. But the shape, if you accept that it's intentional, suggests a hand, or at least something that a human hand might be approximating. Whether this was designed into the map deliberately by the development team as a large-scale Easter egg, or whether it's a coincidence amplified by my own desire to find meaning in the rubble, I genuinely can't say with certainty. I'm including it because the possibility is interesting enough to mention. The 15 Easter eggs in this chapter all share one quality that I want to name before moving on. They're optimistic, not in a naive way, not in a way that ignores what happened, but in the way that people are optimistic when they don't have the luxury of anything else. The bus schedule reprinted while the city was already crumbling, the bags stacked for a return that didn't happen, the mural annotated with a single, stubborn word. All of them are evidence of a world that kept choosing to act as if it had a future. Whoever left these traces was not giving up, and the game preserves that quietly in the corners of its maps for any player willing to stop and look. A quick note before we move on to the next chapter. If you're finding this video useful or interesting, consider clicking the like button. It genuinely helps this kind of content reach more people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good time. There's a lot more to get through. The city districts of Ark Raiders contain dozens of these small layered details beyond the 15 I've described here. I've selected these 15 because together they form the most coherent portrait of the city's final days as a functioning society. Some of the details I left out were interesting in isolation, but didn't add meaningfully to that portrait. Others were ambiguous enough that I didn't feel confident presenting them as intentional design choices rather than coincidences of environmental detail. The editorial process here involved real decisions about what to include and what to set aside, and I want to be transparent about that. The full picture is always larger than any single video can hold. One more thing worth noting about the city district before we go underground. The distribution of these Easter eggs across the physical space of the map isn't random. They cluster in specific areas, around specific types of locations, community spaces, transit infrastructure, the boundaries between zones, the places where many different kinds of people would have converged. This is either deliberate map design, placing Easter eggs where player traffic is highest, or it's something more interesting, a choice to embed the traces of human life in the places where human life was most concentrated. I think it's the second one. But even if it's the first, the effect is the same. You find these details where the people were, which is exactly where you'd expect to find them. Chapter 2. Signals from Below. Easter eggs, 16 through 30. There's a version of Ark Raiders where the underground spaces are just functional, corridors to move through, bunkers to loot, basements to clear. That version of the game exists on one level, but the underground areas of the maps also contain some of the densest concentration of layered detail in the entire game. The Easter eggs in this chapter come from the tunnels, the bunkers, the maintenance corridors, and the transit systems buried beneath the surface. They tell a different story than the city above, quieter in some ways, louder in others. The underground is where things were kept safe, and some of the things kept safe down here aren't supplies or shelter. They're records, evidence, the kind of information people carry underground when they need it to survive. Easter egg 16 is the first thing you'll notice if you spend any time in the maintenance tunnels that run beneath the city district. The walls are covered in a mix of official signage and unofficial additions, the kind of layered communication you'd expect in any space that lots of different people used over a long period of time. But one specific section of wall in a junction between two corridors has something different. There's a long stretch of official maintenance schedules, the kind posted by whoever managed these tunnels. And on one of those schedules, in the margin, written in a different pen, is a name. Just a first name. Petra. And below it, in the same handwriting, a room number. The maintenance schedule is from years before the invasion. The handwritten edition is clearly more recent, based on the degradation difference. Someone who came through these tunnels during or after the collapse was trying to find someone named Petra, or leave information for someone named Petra, and they chose the maintenance schedule because it was something that might still be visible, still be findable. Easter egg 17 involves the transit system. If you enter what remains of a subway or underground rail station on the map, you'll find the usual environmental decay, collapsed platforms, dead trains, the dim emergency lighting that somehow still flickers in spots. But on one platform, there's a detail in the train itself. One of the train cars has its doors open, which is normal, but the seats inside the car have personal items on them. Bags, a jacket, a child's backpack. The distribution of these items suggests they were placed by multiple different people at different times. This wasn't one family or group. Different bags, different styles, different sizes. At some point, this train car was being used as a storage or staging point. Not by one organised group, but by multiple individuals passing through. Someone left a jacket. Later, someone left a bag. The train was going nowhere, but people kept using it. Easter egg 18 is text-based, which puts it in a category of Easter eggs that are easy to walk past if you're not in the habit of reading everything. In the underground spaces, there are stretches of wall where people clearly wrote things over time, building up a kind of informal record. Most of this text is legible only in fragments, and most fragments are mundane, directions, names, warnings. But one section of wall in a slightly more sheltered part of the tunnels has a longer piece of writing. It's written small and carefully, not the rushed scrawl of most graffiti. The content of it, as much as can be read, appears to be someone documenting what they observed about ARC machine behaviour, specific observations written methodically. This suggests someone was doing systematic research into ARC behaviour using only what they could observe from the tunnels. Whether this research ever reached anyone who could use it is unknown. Easter egg 19 is in the bunker sections, specifically in what appears to be a former civil defence shelter. These spaces have their own distinct character, built for a different kind of emergency than the one that actually arrived. The detail here is in the food storage section. The shelter has clearly been used and looted at some point. Shelves are mostly empty, but in one corner behind a collapsed shelving unit that would be difficult to move without effort, there are still supplies, intact, apparently undisturbed. Someone either didn't find them or found them and chose not to take them. If they didn't find them, the cache represents a lucky accident, supplies that survived because they were hidden by collapse rather than by design. If someone found them and left them, that suggests a level of communal thinking, leaving resources for the next person, that the game rarely makes explicit but here seems to quietly acknowledge. Easter egg 20 is one I'd classify as audio-environmental. In the deepest accessible level of the underground areas, there's a point where the ambient sound changes in a way that doesn't quite match the space you're in. Surface sounds, distant rumbles and the characteristic frequencies associated with ARC machine movement are normal. But there's a layer underneath those, a very low regular vibration that's almost felt more than heard. It cycles at a specific interval. It doesn't match any ARC machine signature I've found elsewhere in the game's sound design. The closest analogy from the world before might be something like deep geological survey equipment, or a large pump system running at low power. Whatever is generating that sound is very large, very deep, and apparently still running. Easter egg 21 is a detail in the emergency lighting system. Most of the underground spaces have emergency lighting that either fully on, fully off, or flickering randomly due to damage. But in one corridor, the emergency lights are flickering in a pattern. It's not consistent enough to be immediately obvious as a pattern. You have to stand still and watch for long enough to catch the repetition. When you do, the pattern is clear, short and long pulses, alternating in a sequence that is not consistent with random failure. It's possible this is a leftover automatic system, something programmed to signal in an emergency. It's also possible that something is using this system to communicate. The game doesn't confirm which reading is correct. What it does confirm is that the lights are not broken in a random way. Easter egg 22 is in a section of the underground that appears to have been a maintenance worker break room. Table, lockers, a small kitchen area. Standard issue, but in the lockers, one of them still has a photograph pinned to the inside of the door. It's too degraded to make out the specifics clearly. You can see it's a group photograph of some kind. Multiple people standing together in what looks like an outdoor setting. What makes it notable is that someone has circled one of the figures in the photograph using a marker recently enough that the circle is still relatively clear compared to the photograph itself. They circled one person, and below the photograph, also written recently, just an X. Not a cross in a religious or commemorative sense, just an X, the kind you use to mark something as done or as gone. Easter egg 23 is architectural. In one of the transit tunnels, there's a section of wall that has been breached from the inside. The hole is too small for an adult to pass through comfortably, but it's clearly deliberate. The edges are chipped in a specific direction, suggesting the work was done from this side of the wall, not the other. On the other side of the breach, if you can get a look through, there's a small cavity, not a corridor or a room. A cavity, possibly a pre-existing gap in the construction that was enlarged or modified. Inside the cavity there appear to be items, their shapes visible, but details unclear from the small opening. Someone made a hidden storage space in the wall. They accessed it by working through an already compromised section, rather than cutting new material. It's an intelligent, low-resource solution to the problem of hiding things. Easter egg 24 involves the transit map displays that can still be found on some platforms. Most of these are either too damaged to read or show only the standard route information you'd expect from a transit system. One display, however, has been modified. Someone has used paint or marker to add new routes to the transit map, lines that don't correspond to any of the official tracks on the map. These new lines connect the underground transit system to surface locations that aren't on any official map. Whether this represents actual routes that someone created, makeshift surface paths that correspond roughly to the underground lines, or something more abstract like territorial markings or patrol routes, is unclear. But the care taken in adding them to an official transit display, rather than just drawing on a wall, suggests whoever made this addition was thinking in terms of navigation and coordination. Easter egg 25 is one of the more affecting details in the underground sections, and I want to approach it carefully because the game handles it with some restraint. In a side corridor off one of the main bunker areas, there's a small space that has been clearly set up as a living area. A bedroll, personal items organised carefully, a small collection of books, a container of what might have been water. It's lived in, not just sheltered. But the way it's arranged has a specific quality. Everything is organised with care. Even the books are stacked neatly. This level of organisation in a shelter setting points towards someone who is maintaining their routines even in a difficult situation. The corner of the bedroll is turned down, as if ready to be slept in. It was someone's home, in every meaningful sense of that word, even underground. Easter egg 26 is a technical detail in the bunker's communication systems. Many of these bunkers were equipped with emergency communication equipment, radios, terminals, intercom systems. Most of this equipment is non-functional, but in one bunker's communication room, one of the terminal screens is still active. displaying a low-power standby screen. On that standby screen there's a timestamp. The timestamp is not from before the invasion, it's not from the immediate collapse period, it's from a point in the timeline that suggests someone was operating this terminal well after the surface became uninhabitable by normal standards. Whatever they were communicating, they were doing it from underground, after the world above had already changed completely. The timestamp doesn't tell you what was said, it just tells you that something was. Easter egg 27 requires you to find a specific maintenance access panel in the transit system and open it. The panel is not locked, it's just one of dozens of identical panels in the area, and there's nothing to distinguish it from the outside. But inside, rather than the expected junction of pipes or wiring, there's a small hollow space, and in that space there's a tin container. The tin is sealed. If you interact with it in the game, you can't open it. You can only look at it. But the exterior of the tin has something scratched into it. A series of small marks, lines grouped in fours with a diagonal across each group. The standard tally mark system. The count, if you add them up, comes to 47. 47 of what, and over what period of time, is the question that makes this Easter egg interesting rather than incidental. Easter egg 28 is in the flooding. Several sections of the underground are partially flooded, and the water level, while making movement difficult, also preserves things that would otherwise have degraded. In one flooded corridor, visible just below the waterline, there are objects on the floor. Most of them are the expected fallen debris, but one object, clearly visible if you lean over and look through the water, is a folder or binder of some kind. The pages inside are readable only through the water, and they're blurred, but the format is clearly official documentation, not personal writing. Forms of some kind. Whatever administrative process those forms were part of was apparently still active when someone carried them down here and then left them behind. Easter egg 29 is above the waterline, but connected to the flooding in an interesting way. On the wall at the edge of one of the flooded sections, there are water level marks drawn at different heights, with dates written beside them. The earliest marks are low, the more recent marks are higher. Someone was tracking the rising water level over time, making a formal record of the encroachment. This suggests they were there for long enough to watch it rise, that they had reason to track it, and that they expected to be there long enough for the record to matter. The last mark on the wall doesn't have a date next to it, just the line, and then no more marks after that. Easter egg 30 ends this chapter, and it's the most speculative item in this section, so I'll say that up front. In the deepest part of the accessible underground, in a tunnel section that isn't clearly part of any official infrastructure, there's evidence of excavation. Not old excavation, the kind that's been there since the tunnels were built. More recent, the cut marks in the rock or concrete, depending on which material is exposed at that depth, have a different character than the surrounding surfaces. If this is recent human excavation, someone was digging downward, going deeper than the built infrastructure. What they were looking for, or what they found, or whether they were digging to go somewhere rather than to find something, is entirely open. But someone at some point thought there was a reason to go deeper. The pattern in these underground Easter eggs that I find most interesting is the suggestion of parallel communities, people living and organising separately, unaware of each other or only marginally connected. The person who left the name on the maintenance schedule probably didn't know about the person living in the side corridor with their neatly stacked books. The person tracking the water level marks was probably not the same person who made the hidden cache behind the collapsed shelving. These are traces of individuals and small groups doing their best in the same physical space at different times. The underground held many different people's last efforts, and the game preserves those efforts without editorializing about them. Something I noticed while assembling this chapter is how often the underground Easter eggs relate to record keeping of one kind or another. The tally marks, the water level measurements, the observation notes about ARC machine behaviour, the timestamps on communication terminals. People underground were tracking things, measuring, documenting, keeping records even when there was no clear audience for those records. This seems worth naming because it points towards something about how people respond to overwhelming situations. They count, they write things down, they keep the record alive even when they're not sure anyone will ever read it. Chapter 3. What the Walls Say. Easter Eggs. 31 through 45. If you want to understand what the people of Ark Raiders world went through, the walls are where you spend your time. Not in the combat, not in the loot tables, not even in the audio logs that the game places as collectibles. The walls. Because people write on walls when they run out of other options. They mark things, they leave messages, they record what they need to say, and they say it where someone might eventually walk by and read it. Easter eggs 31 through 45 are all wall-based, spread across different areas of the map, and together they build something that functions almost like a fragmented conversation across time. Easter egg 31 is on an exterior wall of a structure in one of the residential areas. It's a simple list written in black paint in a medium-sized hand. The list has 12 items on it. Some of those items are clearly objects, tools or supplies, or things someone needed. Others appear to be names. The list is organized in a way that suggests two categories were being combined: things needed and people to find, which points toward a small organized group trying to track both resources and personnel at the same time. Several of the items on the list have check marks next to them. Not all of them. The unmarked items, whatever they represent, were either not found or not accomplished. Easter egg 32 is in a stairwell. Stairwells accumulate writing because they're transitional spaces. People pass through them and sometimes they pause. This stairwell has the usual density of markings. But one piece stands out from the others. At the landing between two floors, there's a carefully drawn rectangle on the wall, with a smaller rectangle inside it, and inside that smaller rectangle, a dot. The proportions are consistent, and the drawing is neat, done carefully rather than quickly. It doesn't match any symbol from the Ark Machine iconography visible elsewhere in the game. It's not a faction marker I've been able to identify. It could be a cartographic symbol, a map legend element, where the outer rectangle is a region, the inner one a location, and the dot a specific point. If that reading is correct, this symbol was being used as a shorthand for a specific place, rather than drawn here as a finished message. Easter egg 33 is in a building that appears to have functioned as a school. The writing on the walls here is densely layered, which is appropriate to the space's history. School children write on walls. But one wall has been clearly used as a post-collapse communication surface, with messages from multiple people accumulated over what seems like an extended period. Most of these are too small or degraded to read fully. But near the bottom of this wall, close to the floor, where it would be easy to overlook, there's a section that appears to be written by a child. The letter forms are large and uneven in the way that young handwriting is. The message is short. We waited, but you didn't come. We are going to marker 7. R. This is the most direct piece of writing I've found in the game. It's not atmospheric, it's just a message from R to someone who didn't arrive in time. Easter egg 34 is an interesting contrast to the previous one because it's almost entirely abstract. On the wall of a commercial building, there's a large-scale drawing made in chalk or a light-coloured paint. It depicts an irregular shape, roughly circular, filled with internal divisions. Lines subdivide the large shape into smaller areas, and each smaller area has a simple symbol or letter inside it. It looks strongly like a map. Not a geographical map, but a territorial one, the kind you draw to show how a space is divided up between different groups or purposes. Whether this is a map of the immediate area around the building, of the larger district, of the underground infrastructure below, or of something else entirely, is impossible to determine without more context. But the care put into it, the clear and deliberate line work, suggests it was functional rather than decorative. Easter egg 35 brings us back to text. On the wall of what appears to be a former shop, there's a passage of writing that takes up a substantial section of wall. The text is in a formal register, close to official language, the kind used in public notices or administrative communication. What it appears to be is a set of community rules or agreements. Numbered points establishing expectations for behaviour, resource sharing, use of space. This is a document of the kind that a small organised community would produce when trying to establish stable governance in an unstable situation. The fact that it's written on a wall rather than on paper suggests either that paper was not available in quantity or that the community wanted these rules to be permanent and visible to anyone who passed through, not just to members who had access to a circulated document. Easter egg 36 is in the residue of a fire. One wall in a primarily residential area has been fire damaged, and through the char and soot there's older writing visible underneath. The fire damage is layered over the writing, which means the writing predates the fire. Through the damage, fragments are legible, enough fragments to suggest the original writing was a long personal narrative of some kind. Not instructions or rules, but a story, or a journal entry. The fragments that are most clearly visible seem to describe a specific series of events, a journey or a sequence of decisions. Whatever the full text said, someone chose to write a long personal account on this wall, rather than on paper they could carry, which might mean they wanted it to stay, to be readable here, attached to this place. Easter egg 37 is in the door frames. It's easy to miss because door frames are structural elements that the eye tends to slide past without registering as surfaces for information. But in the residential areas, a significant number of door frames have markings on them. Not all of them, specific ones. The markings are small and consistent, small vertical scratches grouped together, and they appear at a height that would be easy for an adult to make without stopping or crouching. If you map out which door frames have these markings and which don't, a pattern emerges. The marked door frames are not random. They form a route. Someone was marking a path through the residential area, door by door, for navigation or for some kind of survey. Easter egg 38 is a response to existing graffiti. In one location, there's a large piece of graffiti that was clearly made before the collapse, stylistic and decorative in the way pre-collapse street art usually is, but overlaid on top of it, using the original piece almost as a surface for annotation, there are marks and words that came later. The post-collapse editions interact with the original art in interesting ways. Lines drawn over painted figures, words placed in the mouths or hands of painted characters. It's hard to tell whether this was done respectfully, in a spirit of conversation with the original art, or whether the later author was indifferent to the original and was simply using available surface. The interaction between the two layers of the piece creates something neither layer contains on its own. Easter egg 39 is one of the entries on this list that I want to describe carefully because it touches on something I think the game is doing deliberately in this area of the map. In several locations across the residential zones, you find the same symbol drawn in a light-coloured material, chalk or pale paint. The symbol is a simple one, a horizontal line with two shorter lines descending from it, like a very basic figure seen from behind, shoulders, and spine. It appears consistently at approximately the same height in locations that share one characteristic. They're all spaces with a clear view of a significant structure, a skyline element, a specific building. The symbol appears only where you can see this particular sightline. Whatever it means, it seems to be a response to that view. Easter egg 40 is text-based and located inside a building that appears to have been a medical facility, a clinic or small hospital. The walls in the main corridor are standard medical institution white, and against this clean background, the writing is more visible than it would be elsewhere. There are two distinct phases of wall writing here. The first is official, printed notices and instructions in the style of health information communication, things like hygiene guidelines and emergency protocols. The second layer is handwritten over and around these official notices. The handwritten layer is denser and more varied than usual. It includes what appear to be personal accounts of medical situations, descriptions of symptoms and treatments, informal records of who was treated for what. This wall was functioning as a medical record, an unofficial one, maintained by whoever was operating this space after the official record system stopped working. Easter egg 41 is in the material of the wall itself rather than on its surface. In one location in the industrial fringe of the residential area, there's a wall that has been repaired using entirely non-standard materials. The repaired section is clearly newer than the surrounding wall, and the repair work uses pieces of plastic, scraps of metal sheeting, pieces of what looks like flooring, all held together with what might be an improvised sealant or adhesive. The repair is functional in the sense that it fills the gap it was made to fill, but it also serves as a kind of incidental catalogue of available materials at the time it was made. Whoever patched this wall used exactly what they had, and what they had was a specific combination of salvageable materials that tells you something about what was available to them and what wasn't. Easter egg 42 is one of those Easter eggs that becomes more interesting the longer you look at it. On a wall in the transitional space between residential and commercial zones, there's a large collection of small paper pieces attached to the surface. They've degraded significantly, but they're still attached, still in place. The papers are in a variety of sizes and colours, and they're arranged in a grid pattern. Each paper occupies a specific position in the grid. Some positions in the grid are empty. This is a visual system of some kind, a display board or tracking system where the position of each paper in the grid has meaning. Whether it was tracking people, resources, tasks, or something else entirely is speculative, but the grid format and the partially filled state of it suggest that whatever it was tracking was an ongoing process at some point, one that was never completed. Easter egg 43 is auditory in a way that connects to a visual element on the wall. In a corridor near one of the bunker access points, there's a wall with a series of hash marks, traditional tally marks, counting time or quantity. If you count the marks, you arrive at a specific number. If you then spend time near the audio loop that runs in this corridor, you'll notice that one specific element of the ambient sound, a rhythmic mechanical element that's easy to interpret as background machinery, repeats at an interval that, if you counted the repetitions over a set period, would give you the same number. The tally on the wall and the repeating audio element appear to be synchronized. This is either an elaborate coincidence in the sound design, or it's an intentional detail planted by the development team, a hidden connection between the visual record and the audio environment that rewards the player who is paying attention to both simultaneously. Easter egg 44 is about absence rather than presence. In one building in the residential zone, there's a wall that has been clearly used as a surface for pinning or taping papers, photographs, notes, the usual community documentation. But the papers have been removed. What remains is the evidence of their presence. Small tears where papers were pulled away, adhesive residue in regular patterns, pinholes in groups. From the pattern of residue and damage, you can estimate approximately how many items were on this wall and roughly what sizes they were. Whatever was on this wall was removed deliberately, taken by someone, rather than simply fallen or degraded away. Someone decided to take this information with them rather than leave it, or someone decided that it shouldn't be left behind. Easter egg 45 closes this chapter with something that functions almost as a summary of what these walls have been showing us. In the most heavily trafficked area of the residential zone, on a wall that sits at a natural meeting point between multiple routes through the space, there's a single sentence written in large, clear letters, large enough to read easily at a distance. The sentence is in a plain declarative register. No flourish, no urgency in the lettering. It reads, as far as I can make out, as a statement of location, a declaration that a specific group was here at a specific time, that they moved on, and the direction they went. It's a departure note, written big enough that it couldn't be missed, written in a hand steady enough to suggest it wasn't written in fear. Someone left this place and wanted it known that they had been here and where they were going. There's a specific reading of these wall-based Easter eggs that I keep coming back to. The walls of the Ark Raiders maps are functioning as a kind of distributed, uncoordinated archive. No single person planned this archive. No one decided these walls would be the record. But people kept adding to them anyway, kept writing and marking and documenting, because the impulse to leave a record is persistent in a way that ordinary disasters don't seem to diminish. If anything, in these maps it seems to intensify. The worse things got, the more people wrote on the walls, as if the act of marking a surface meant something had been witnessed. The variety and the quality and character of the wall writing across these Easter eggs is also worth noting. Some of it is organised and methodical, the community rules, the medical records, the directional systems. Some of it is hasty, the departure notes and urgent messages. Some of it is personal and even tender, the child's message to whoever didn't come in time. The walls held all of it without distinction, organised and desperate and patient and grieving, side by side, in the same spaces, layered over each other across time. That's a more honest portrait of a community under pressure than any single narrative could give you. Chapter 4. Ark Architecture. Easter eggs 46 through 60. The Ark machines are not random. That's one of the things the game is very deliberate about suggesting without stating outright. When you look closely at the structures and systems they leave behind, or build, or repurpose, there are patterns, consistent choices, design principles that recur across different areas of the map. Easter eggs 46 through 60 are about those patterns, about the way Ark machines interact with the built environment and what that interaction suggests about their purpose or their programming or something else entirely that we don't have clean language for yet. I want to be careful in this chapter about the line between observation and projection. What I can say for certain is that these details are present in the game. What I can't say for certain is exactly what they mean. Easter egg 46 is one of the foundational entries in this chapter, and you'll want to keep it in mind as context for several of the ones that follow. In the areas of the map where Ark machines have been present for an extended period, the surrounding structures show a specific type of modification, not damage from combat or movement. Modification: surfaces have been reshaped, openings have been widened or narrowed, internal layouts have been altered. The modifications share a consistent aesthetic: smooth curves where human construction tends toward angles, regularity where human improvisation creates variation. This is a design language, not an accident. The Ark machines were building something, or at minimum they were reshaping the human environment according to principles that weren't random. Easter egg 47 is a routing observation. If you track the movement of Ark machines through the map over multiple sessions, you'll notice that they don't patrol randomly. They follow paths. Those paths are consistent between sessions, though they can shift over time. What's interesting about those paths is their relationship to pre-existing infrastructure. Ark machine patrol routes frequently follow human infrastructure, not roads or corridors, but utility runs, power lines, water mains, underground cable routes. Whatever principles govern their navigation, proximity to utility infrastructure seems to be one of them. Whether they're drawn to it, mapping it, or using it for some function isn't clear, but the correlation between patrol routes and utility infrastructure is specific enough to be meaningful. Easter egg 48 is in the material evidence of Ark construction. In areas where Ark machines have built or modified structures, the construction material is clearly non-standard from a human perspective. It doesn't match any material palette that the human-made structures use, but it does have a consistent internal structure and a consistent set of properties, weight, apparent density, surface texture. If you find multiple examples of ARC-constructed material across the map and compare them, they are functionally identical. The same material produced consistently in multiple locations. This implies either a centralized production source or a consistent manufacturing process distributed across multiple units. Either way, it suggests a level of coordination that goes beyond what the ARC machine's observable in-game behavior might lead you to assume. Easter egg 49 is an observation about ARC machine modifications to human lighting systems. In areas where ARC machines have been active, the lighting has been altered, sometimes physically by repositioning or replacing fixtures, sometimes functionally by connecting to existing systems and changing their output. The altered lighting consistently produces light in a specific frequency range that differs from standard human illumination. The human eye processes it as slightly off, a quality to the light that's difficult to name, but perceptible once you're aware of it. Whether this frequency range serves a functional purpose for the ARC machines themselves, perhaps optimizing for their own sensory systems, or whether it has a different function entirely is speculative, but the consistency of the alteration across multiple locations is not. Easter egg 50 sits at the midpoint of this chapter, and it's one I've spent the most time thinking about. In several locations across the map, ARC machines have incorporated human objects into their constructed or modified environments. Not randomly, not as debris, but deliberately. Specific objects placed or integrated in specific ways. The objects are varied: personal items, technological equipment, structural components. What they have in common is harder to identify. They're not all valuable from a human perspective. They're not all technological in nature. If they share a quality, it might be that they all have high information density in some sense, complex manufacturing, unique surface characteristics, or high data content. One possible reading is that the ARC machines are collecting and incorporating objects that have properties relevant to some larger process, the nature of which isn't clear from the objects alone. Easter egg 51 is in the audio signature of ARC-modified spaces. Spaces that ARC machines have extensively modified have a different sound character than spaces that haven't been touched. Some of this is explainable by the physical modifications. Different materials produce different acoustic properties. But there's a layer of the sound character that doesn't seem to be explicable purely by acoustics, a quality to the ambient sound that suggests active signal generation rather than passive resonance. If you spend enough time in these spaces paying attention to the audio environment, there are components in the lower frequency ranges that are present in ARC-modified spaces and absent in untouched spaces. What's generating these components is unclear, but their presence is consistent enough across multiple ARC-modified locations to be a pattern rather than an anomaly. Easter egg 52 is about the heights. ARC machine modifications to human structures share a consistent feature that's easy to overlook because it's distributed across many different types of changes. The modifications almost always alter the effective ceiling height of a space, either by raising what was there, by removing partition walls and ceilings, or by building platforms or elevated elements that effectively create a new working surface at a specific height. The consistent height across different types of modification and in different original structures is approximately 2.5 meters in the areas most extensively modified. This is a consistent working height, higher than standard human workspace ergonomics, but clearly deliberate. Whatever the ARC machines are optimized for, that height preference is reflected consistently in how they reshape a space. Easter egg 53 is a detail in Arc Machine visual marking systems. The Arc Machines leave visual marks on surfaces they've modified, and not all of these marks are functional in the sense of being structural markers or indicators. Some of them appear to be purely informational, recordings of some kind. In one specific location, the marks on a modified surface form a sequence that suggests a record of occupancy or activity over time. The sequence has a clear beginning and a less clear current state, implying it's ongoing. The format of the sequence uses a consistent unit, a basic geometric shape, repeated with modifications, additions, changes in orientation or scale, to represent different states or quantities. If this is a record-keeping system, it's a compact and organized one. The parallel to human tally marks is obvious. Easter egg 54 requires you to look at the interface between Arc construction and human construction. In areas where Arc machines have built directly against or over human structures rather than replacing them, the junction between the two construction systems is interesting. Human structures are built with tolerances, gaps, flexibility in the material connections. Arc construction, based on what's visible at these junctions, uses no tolerances. The materials are fitted together with a precision that goes beyond what human construction methods can typically achieve. At the junction point, Arc material is fitted to human material with a contact that's essentially complete. No visible gap, no movement. What this means practically is that the Arc construction is bonded to the human structure with more structural intimacy than the human structure has with itself. Easter egg 55 is about entrances. In Arc-modified structures, the entry points, the ways in and out of a space, share a specific characteristic. They're modified to be either smaller or larger than standard human doorway dimensions, never the same. And they're never placed in the locations human construction would put a doorway against a wall with a clear exterior or adjacent space. They're cut through walls in locations that suggest a different logic for how you approach a space, from above, from below, from an angle, through a non-obvious opening. The pattern of entrances in Arc-modified spaces, if you map them across multiple locations, suggests that the Arc machine's concept of how you enter and exit a space is fundamentally different from human convention. Easter egg 56 is in what might be a power distribution system. In heavily modified areas, there are structural elements that run along the walls and ceilings in patterns consistent with utility routing. They're not wiring in any human sense, they don't use the same materials or connection methods. But their routing, their distribution through the space, follows patterns similar to electrical distribution systems, branching from what appear to be larger conduits into smaller and more specific runs. Whatever they're distributing, the distribution architecture looks recognizable, even if the technology doesn't. And in several locations, these runs terminate at the human objects that Arc machines have incorporated into their constructed environments, which suggests that whatever is being distributed is somehow relevant to those objects. Easter egg 57 is smaller than the previous few, but I want to include it because it adds a specific texture to this chapter. In an Arc-modified corridor, on one of the surfaces that has been clearly worked over by Arc processes, there's a section that's different. The texture changes. The material composition appears to be the same, but the surface treatment in this section is distinct, more detailed, with a fine-grained structure that contrasts with the otherwise smooth finishing of the surrounding area. This finer section is about the size of a human hand. Its location, at roughly chest height on what would be a corridor wall, places it in exactly the position a human would naturally reach out and touch. Whether this is coincidence or whether the Arc machines place something worth touching at a height relevant to human interaction is a question without a clean answer. Easter egg 58 brings us back to scale. In one area of the map, there's a structure that the Arc machines have built from scratch, not a modification of existing human construction, but an original construction on a cleared site. This structure, when you look at it in its entirety, has proportions that are not human. Not dramatically alien, not incomprehensibly strange, but subtly off in ways that accumulates into a clear statement that this was not built for human habitation or use. The ceiling is that consistent 2.5 meters at operational height, but extends much higher in sections that appear to be ventilation or light management. The floor is not flat, it has a slight gradient throughout, draining toward a central collection point. The proportions of every room are wider than they are long, which inverts the human architectural convention. It's a complete architectural grammar that isn't human, and it was built here, in the middle of a human city. Easter egg 59 is about what the Ark machines leave behind when they move on. In areas that appear to have been modified and then abandoned by Ark machines, there's a specific decay pattern. The Ark-constructed material degrades differently than human construction. It doesn't crumble or crack in the ways human materials do. It tends toward a specific failure mode, delamination at internal interfaces within the material itself rather than surface erosion. This gives Ark-constructed ruins a distinctive character, surfaces that are still smooth and intact looking from outside, but hollow underneath in specific structural planes. The decay pattern is consistent enough that it could be used to identify former Ark-occupied spaces, even where the surfaces have been further modified or covered by later activity. Easter egg 60 closes this chapter, and it's the most speculative item in this section. In the most extensively Ark-modified area of the map that's accessible to players, there's a space that, when you stand in it and look around at the Ark-built environment, has a quality that several people I've discussed this game with independently described as intentional, not functional, not efficient, intentional in the aesthetic sense. The proportions, the material choices, the routing of the utility systems, the placement of the incorporated human objects, the light quality, all of it together creates an environment that feels designed rather than engineered. The distinction matters. Engineering optimizes for function. Design, in the sense I mean it here, also considers experience, whether the Ark machines designed this space to be experienced in a specific way, or whether that quality is an emergent property of their functional processes, and the human brain's tendency to find intention in patterns, is the question I keep coming back to. The through line in this chapter's Easter eggs is consistency. The Ark machines are consistent in their construction heights, their material properties, their modification patterns, their audio signatures. That consistency across multiple locations and multiple types of modification points towards something important. These aren't improvising. Whatever principles govern their behavior are stable and applied reliably across a wide range. That's not how a malfunctioning or chaotic system behaves. It's how a system with coherent underlying goals behaves. What those goals are remains the question that the Ark Raiders maps keep pointing toward without answering directly. Chapter 5. The People Left Behind, Easter Eggs, 61 through 75. There's a tendency in post-apocalyptic game environments to treat the people who didn't make it out as background, props, evidence of a catastrophe rather than individuals who lived through it for as long as they could. Ark Raiders is better than that in places, and the Easter eggs in this chapter are some of the reasons why. Easter eggs 61 through 75 are about the individual human stories embedded in the map, not the broad strokes of the lore, not faction histories or invasion timelines. The specific, small details that point toward particular lives, people who had habits and hobbies and ways of organizing their world that survived the invasion long enough to leave a trace. Easter egg 61 is in a residential apartment. The apartment is unremarkable from a loot perspective, which is probably why most players don't spend much time in it. But if you do, you'll find a shelf of books. Not an unusual detail, but the books on this shelf have been organised by colour rather than by title or author or genre. It's a specific organisational choice, an aesthetic one, the kind of choice someone makes in a home that they care about and take pride in. The books themselves suggest a specific reading taste if you look at the spines, a mix of technical non-fiction and what appear to be novels, weighted toward a particular period of fiction. Someone lived here who organised their books by colour and read widely. That's a specific person, not a demographic. Easter egg 62 is in a kitchen. The cabinets have been largely emptied, which is expected, but one cabinet still contains a collection of jars and containers. The containers themselves are empty, but the labels are visible. They're not commercial labels, they're handwritten labels in a careful hand, with the names of foods or spices and what appear to be dates. This is a home preserver's cabinet, someone who grew or prepared their own foods and stored them carefully. The dates on the labels are old enough to suggest this was a long-standing practice, not a post-collapse improvisation. The handwriting on the labels is the same on all of them, consistent over a long period, suggesting one person maintained this cabinet for years. Whoever lived in this apartment made their own food stores and kept them organised with dates. Easter egg 63 is in the evidence of a hobby. In one room of a residential building, there's a workspace, a desk with tools and materials. The tools are craft tools, the kind used for making small objects by hand. The materials suggest metalwork or jewellery making or some related discipline requiring fine manipulation. The workspace is organised in a way that reflects practice, tools arranged in a working order, materials sorted by type and size. Whoever worked here was not a casual hobbyist. The level of organisation, the quality of the tools, the quantity of materials, all point towards someone who invested seriously in this skill. What they made, whether for personal use or as trade goods or as gifts, is another question. But the skill and the investment in it are clear. Easter egg 64 is in a child's bedroom. The bedroom is small, as children's rooms often are. The furniture is built-in, space-efficient, practical. What makes this room notable is the ceiling. The ceiling of this room has been covered in hand-painted stars. Not stickers, not a printed pattern. Painted, by hand, in a roughly accurate representation of a portion of the night sky, with the stars sized and spaced with attention to their actual relative positions. Someone, adult or child, painted this ceiling by hand with attention to astronomical accuracy. The constellation patterns that are visible in the painted section are correct. Someone looked up at the sky and then went home and painted what they saw on a child's ceiling. Easter egg 65 is in the evidence of community maintenance. In the residential block, there are spaces that were clearly used for communal purposes: laundry areas, storage, shared utilities. In one of these spaces, there's a maintenance log, not an official one, a handwritten notebook left in the space and evidently passed between whoever used it. Entries record small maintenance actions, repairs made, supplies used, problems noted. The entries are in multiple handwriting styles, confirming multiple authors. They span an extended period. The tone of the entries is matter-of-fact and cooperative. Problems are noted without accusation. Repairs are recorded without self-congratulation. It's the record of a community that was functioning, maintaining itself through shared effort and honest communication. The last entry notes that a specific system needs attention and that whoever gets to it first should leave a note. Easter egg 66 is in a photograph that requires some explanation of how photographs work as evidence in this kind of environmental storytelling. Photographs in the game environment can't be examined in high detail. You see their general composition and colour, sometimes a rough sense of subject matter. This photograph, in a frame on a wall in a residential space, shows what appears to be a group of people in an outdoor setting, possibly a celebration. What makes it notable is its placement. It's not in a private space. It's in what appears to have been a communal area, a hallway or gathering room. It was hung where everyone who used the space would see it. A community photograph, not a private one. Someone's private memory was made into a shared reference point for the group. Easter egg 67 is about medical improvisation. In a residential area, there's a room that was clearly converted into a medical space. This is a common enough detail in post-collapse environments, but this particular space has a level of resourcefulness in its improvised medical setup that's worth noting. The supplies are organised using categories that match actual medical triage principles. The wound treatment area is separate from the recovery area. There's a documentation system, a board with names and status updates in dry erase marker. The person or people who set this up had real medical knowledge and applied it with real materials under difficult conditions. The documentation board still has names on it. Some of the names have status updates. A few of the names have a simple mark next to them that in the context of a medical facility has a clear and sobering meaning. Easter egg 68 is in the evidence of education. In a residential area, in a room that might have been a living room or a shared space, there are marks on the wall that suggest a teaching or learning environment. Equations on one section, letters and words on another, simple diagrams. The marks are at multiple heights, which means they were made by or for people of different sizes, adults and children, together. Someone was running informal education sessions in this space. The range of material, arithmetic alongside reading, practical knowledge alongside more abstract content, suggests the sessions served a mixed group with varying levels of prior education. Someone prioritised keeping knowledge alive and transferable even when everything else was falling apart. Easter egg 69 is in the smallest possible detail, and for that reason, it's probably my favourite in this chapter. In a residential hallway, on a doorframe, there are height marks, the kind families make to track how a child is growing. They have dates next to them, names, small notes. The marks start at a height consistent with a young child and progress upward. There are marks from before the invasion period, and there are marks after. The marks after the invasion continue. They continue past the invasion, past the collapse, past the point where this should have been possible. Someone kept making marks on that doorframe, kept measuring, kept dating, kept noting. Whatever was happening in the world, outside that door, inside it, someone was still watching a child grow. Easter egg 70 is in an unlikely location. In what appears to be a commercial building, not a residential one, there's a small space that someone created in a corner, clearly an informal occupation. A bedroll, a few personal items, but the particular personal items are unusual for a survival context. Among the standard necessities, there's a musical instrument. Small, portable, it's not broken. It's placed with the other items carefully, given the same consideration as the practical objects. Whoever sheltered in this corner brought music with them and kept it. That choice of what to carry tells you more about a person than almost any other kind of evidence. This person made room in their survival kit for something to play. Easter egg 71 is about shared space over time. In a large residential building, there's an internal courtyard or atrium that would have been a communal gathering space. The space shows evidence of use by multiple groups over time, with different phases of occupation identifiable by the different types and styles of marks left behind. Early occupation shows the organised, intentional marking of a functional community. Later occupation shows more individual, fragmented activity. The transition between phases isn't documented anywhere in the space, but it's visible in the character of the marks. Something changed in the composition or organisation of the group that used this space. Whether that change was voluntary or forced by circumstances is another question the space doesn't answer directly. Easter egg 72 is an item found in what appears to be a personal storage space, possibly a storage unit or a small workshop. Among the items in the space is a handmade notebook. The notebook's exterior is visible. Its interior content is not fully readable in the context of the game, but the construction of the notebook itself is notable. It's made from a variety of paper sources, clearly not commercial notebook paper, but an assembly of available materials, different weights, and colours of paper bound together with care. The pages are evenly cut and the binding is neat. Someone made a notebook because they needed one, and made it well, because craftsmanship was important to them, even in a situation where it didn't need to be. The quality of the work is its own statement. Easter egg 73 is in the evidence of a garden. In an outdoor space attached to a residential building or on a roof, there are planting containers and grow beds. The plants themselves are long dead, and the containers are partially collapsed. But the layout of the growing space is deliberate and intelligent. The beds are arranged to maximize light exposure for the specific orientation of the space. The container types suggest different plant types were grown in different areas, a practical division by plant need. Whoever created this growing space understood horticulture well enough to design the space for efficiency. They were feeding people. In the upper corner of one of the growing areas, there's a small marker, a stick with something tied to it. The thing tied to it is too degraded to identify, but the marker was put there for a reason. Easter egg 74 is in a workshop space. The workshop has a project on the main bench, partially assembled, clearly mid-process. The component suggests something mechanical, a device of some kind, functional rather than decorative. Without being able to identify the exact device, it's possible to say that the components suggest a purpose related to communication or detection, the kinds of things you'd prioritize building in a situation where information was hard to come by. The assembly is careful and shows clear understanding of the principles involved. Whoever was building this knew what they were doing. They stopped in the middle. They didn't disassemble it and move on. They left it as it was, mid-process on the bench, as if they expected to come back. Easter egg 75 closes this chapter with something I want to describe plainly. In the most lived-in corner of the most thoroughly human space I've found in the residential areas, there's a collection of objects that appears to have been deliberately assembled together and left in a visible location. The collection includes practical items and personal ones. It's mixed in a way that suggests it wasn't assembled for any functional purpose. It's more like a gathering of things that mattered, arranged together deliberately in a space where someone lived. There's no note with it, no explanation, just the objects arranged with clear intention. Someone left this place and chose to leave these things here, arranged where they could be seen, whether as a memorial, a signal, or simply because carrying them was no longer possible. The arrangement stands. The human stories in this chapter share a quality of persistence, not the dramatic persistence of survival narratives, the heroic struggle against impossible odds, something quieter, the persistence of routine. People who kept cooking their food carefully and labelling their jars, people who kept maintaining the communal systems, people who kept measuring a child's height on a doorframe. Routine is how people hold the world stable when the world keeps trying to destabilize, and these Easter eggs are full of it, full of the small, deliberate actions of people who kept doing what they had always done, because stopping felt like giving something up that they weren't willing to give. Chapter 6, Before They Came. Easter eggs 76 through 90. Everything in Ark Raiders exists in the shadow of the invasion, but there was a world before it, and some of that world is still legible in the maps if you know where to look. Easter eggs 76 through 90 are about the before. The life that existed prior to Ark machines, the infrastructure of a civilization at a specific point in its development, the things that were happening in the world before the world ended. This chapter is necessarily speculative because the game doesn't give us a detailed pre-invasion history, but the physical record that remains in the maps points toward a specific kind of society at a specific kind of moment, one that was in the middle of several significant transitions at once. Easter egg 76 is an advertisement, or what's left of one. On a building exterior, there's the remnant of a large commercial billboard or advertisement panel. The printed material is largely degraded, but the structure holding it remains. In the lower portion of the display, where the material is somewhat better preserved due to being shielded by the upper section, there are fragments of text and imagery. The text is commercial, in register, promotional language for a product or service. The imagery fragments suggest a specific visual aesthetic associated with a particular period of design history. The advertisement was placed by a company active in a specific commercial sector at a specific moment in the world's recent past. It's a brand, a real artifact of the market economy that existed before everything else did. Easter egg 77 is in the transportation infrastructure. The road markings visible in the city districts include standard lane markings and regulatory signage, and also a category of marking that suggests infrastructure at a specific point of development. There are charging infrastructure markers, specifically the kind used for electric and hybrid vehicle charging points. The distribution and density of these markers tells you something about the state of transportation technology at the point the invasion occurred. The infrastructure was clearly in the process of being built out rather than being complete. There are more charging points in some areas than others, in the patterns you'd expect from an early-stage infrastructure rollout. The world of Arc Raiders was in the middle of a transportation transition when the Arc machines arrived. Easter egg 78 is in the commercial architecture. Several of the commercial buildings in the city districts have architectural characteristics that point toward a specific period of construction and a specific economic context. Energy efficiency features are prominent: solar panels on rooftops, green facade systems, visible thermal management structures. These features are consistent with a period of significant commercial investment in sustainable design. The density of these features, seen across multiple buildings in the commercial zone, suggests that energy efficiency was a prominent commercial concern in the pre-invasion economy. Not a niche consideration, but a mainstream commercial priority. The world was building greener before it stopped building at all. Easter egg 79 is in an administrative building. Office environments in the game contain the usual detritus of working life, papers, equipment, personal items. But in one administrative building, there's a conference room with something still on the wall, behind the main presentation position. A large display or board has a slide or page still showing. The content is too degraded to read fully, but the format is consistent with a specific type of professional communication, a planning document, something with a timeline and milestone structure. The portions that are legible suggest a large infrastructure or development project with a long timeline that extended well past the point at which the invasion would have occurred. Someone was planning years into a future that didn't arrive as planned. Easter egg 80 is in the evidence of journalism. In a building that appears to have been a media organisation of some kind, there are materials that suggest active news production, story notes, interview records, photography equipment. The specific combination of these materials and their arrangement paints a picture of an organisation that was actively documenting the world as it was changing. The notes and records that are partially readable seem to focus on infrastructure, economy, policy, the normal work of a journalism operation covering a society in motion. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggests they knew what was coming. Just people doing the work of recording a world that was about to change in ways nobody had their cameras pointed at. Easter egg 81 is in the evidence of the scientific community. In a university or research environment adjacent to the city district, there are research materials that suggest specific active areas of inquiry. The materials are too specific to be generic set dressing. The subject matter of the research, as readable from the fragments of documentation, suggests active work in a field that connects in interesting ways to what the Ark machines later proved to be capable of. The connection is suggestive rather than explicit. It's possible the research was entirely coincidental to the invasion. It's also possible that whatever the Ark machines represent was already a theoretical or practical concern in human research before they arrived physically. One possible reading is that the world wasn't entirely unprepared, just not prepared enough. Easter egg 82 is in the evidence of a specific cultural moment visible in the maps. Across several different spaces, in residences and commercial spaces and public areas, there are artifacts that point toward a period of significant technological transition in consumer culture. The devices, the interfaces, the consumer products visible in these spaces cluster around a specific generational moment in technology development. Not the earliest stages of digital consumer culture, not the most recent. A specific midpoint that suggests the Ark Raiders world had reached a particular development stage. This matters because it tells you what kind of society existed before, what its relationship with its own technology was, and how prepared or unprepared that relationship would have made it for the arrival of something both technologically superior and fundamentally alien. Easter egg 83 is in a library or archival space. The collection that remains, largely damaged but partially intact, tells you something about the intellectual priorities of the culture that accumulated it. The subject distribution of the surviving materials, weighted toward practical sciences and history, with strong representation of fiction and arts, is consistent with a public collection rather than a specialized one. What it also shows is the collection development decisions of recent decades, the new acquisitions that indicate what was considered worth preserving. Recent acquisitions in the collection emphasize environmental science, systems theory, and information technology. The world before the invasion was a world that knew it faced challenges and was trying to understand them systematically. It just wasn't anticipating this particular challenge. Easter egg 84 is in the evidence of political life. In a civic building, there are materials that suggest active democratic processes were happening close to the point of the invasion. Voter registration materials, campaign documentation, planning materials for public events. The specifics of the political content are not legible enough to characterize the political positions involved, but the existence of the activity itself, the infrastructure of an active civil society, is clear. Whatever the specific politics were, the structures of civic participation were functioning. People were voting or preparing to. They were planning public gatherings in an organized way. The machinery of a functioning society was running right up until it stopped. Easter egg 85 is about food culture and the evidence of a specific economic moment. In a restaurant or food service space, the remnants of the operation tell a story about the kind of food economy that existed before the collapse. The menu fragments that are visible, the equipment installed, the storage and preparation systems, point toward a specific kind of commercial food culture, one that valued sourcing information and preparation transparency. Not the food culture of scarcity, not the food culture of pure convenience, the food culture of a moment of relative abundance and attention to quality. Someone ran this restaurant for people who cared about what they were eating and where it came from. It seems, in retrospect, like the most profound kind of peace. Easter egg 86 is in the evidence of connectivity, the communications infrastructure visible in the map, from physical cable runs to the remnants of wireless infrastructure, tells you about the degree to which the pre-invasion world was networked. The density of infrastructure and the distribution of access points is consistent with high connectivity across the population. This was a society where digital connectivity was assumed, not exceptional. The infrastructure for continuous communication, for always-on information access, was everywhere. When the invasion disrupted this infrastructure, it would have been immediately catastrophic, not just as a communication loss, but as a disruption to the basic fabric of how people navigated daily life. The world was dependent on its networks. The networks went down. Easter egg 87 is in a medical context that predates the collapse. In what appears to be a pre-invasion medical facility, there are records and equipment consistent with a specific standard of medical care. The technology level, the documentation systems, the facility design, all point toward a society with relatively high baseline healthcare provision. Not perfect, not universal, but significant. The contrast between this pre-invasion standard and the improvised medical spaces visible elsewhere in the map is part of what makes the post-invasion situation legible as a catastrophe rather than just a change. Something specific was lost, a specific level of care for people that the improvised systems were trying to approximate with much less. Easter egg 88 is in the evidence of leisure. In a recreational facility, the equipment and infrastructure of pre-invasion leisure culture is partially preserved. Sports equipment, entertainment technology, spaces designed for social gathering and play. These details are easy to dismiss as set dressing, but they do a specific job. They establish that the people of this world had leisure, had time and resources for non-essential activities, had a relationship with play and rest and social gathering that went beyond survival. When you see the post-invasion spaces, the survival-oriented, resource-constrained, pragmatically organised spaces, you're seeing the absence of what was here before. The contrast is the point. Easter egg 89 is in an educational context. In a school building, the curriculum materials and classroom setups tell you about the educational priorities and standards of the pre-invasion society. The subjects represented, the pedagogical approaches visible in the classroom arrangements, the level of resource investment in educational infrastructure, all of it builds a picture of a specific kind of society with specific ideas about what children needed to know and how they should learn it. It's a normative picture, a vision of what childhood was supposed to be. The contrast with the improvised education, visible in the post-invasion spaces, the kitchen table teaching, the wall-written lessons, is another form of loss accounting that the game does quietly and consistently. Easter egg 90 closes this chapter with something that feels almost too on point to be coincidence. In one of the most intact pre-invasion spaces in the map, there's a calendar. Not a planning calendar or a work calendar, a personal calendar, the kind with photographs and inspirational content for each month. The calendar is from a specific point in the timeline, close to but before the invasion. It's open to a specific month. The photograph for that month shows a landscape, an outdoor scene of something beautiful and large-scale, sky and earth in some combination. The inspirational text for the month, partially readable, contains something about preparation or readiness or the value of anticipating change. It's the kind of generic motivational content that appears on this type of calendar everywhere, stripped of specific meaning by repetition. Except in this context, on this month, it lands differently. What this chapter adds up to, for me, is a portrait of a world that was completely ordinary. That's the thing the pre-invasion Easter eggs communicate most strongly. Not that the world before was perfect, not that it was especially prepared or especially doomed, just that it was ordinary. People were working and commuting and running restaurants and managing their email and planning for infrastructure projects that would take years to complete. The invasion didn't arrive into a world that was already at the edge of something. It arrived into a Tuesday, and that ordinariness is what makes the before and after legible as a real loss rather than a narrative convenience. Chapter 7. Classified Ground. Easter eggs 91 through 105. The military and government presence in the Ark Raiders world is not background texture. It is a layer of the world's history that the maps make specifically visible, and what that layer contains is more interesting than a first pass through these spaces would suggest. Easter eggs 91 through 105 come from areas of the map associated with secure facilities, classified or controlled spaces that existed before the invasion and that retain the physical evidence of their purpose even now that everyone who worked in them is gone. If you want to understand what the institutions knew and when they knew it, this is the part of the video to pay attention to. These 15 items taken together build a portrait of state awareness that the game never states directly, but that the physical record of these spaces makes very hard to ignore. Easter egg 91 is in the physical security infrastructure of the areas adjacent to secure facilities. The approach zones and perimeters have the layered security architecture of spaces that were meant to be difficult to enter without authorization. Barriers, controlled access points, camera mounts and sensor housings, the full physical apparatus of institutional access control. What's notable here is not the existence of this security infrastructure, but its density and specificity. The level of investment in physical access control is consistent with facilities housing genuinely sensitive materials or activities. Not bureaucratic security theatre, not the kind of checkbox security that offices install to satisfy insurance requirements. Someone genuinely did not want people in these spaces without permission. Whatever was inside warranted the cost of what was built outside to keep it managed. Easter egg 92 is in the identity management systems at facility entrance areas. The remnants of access verification infrastructure tell you about the operational character of whatever was happening here. The technology level is specific, more sophisticated than standard commercial security, less extreme than the most classified military installations. Biometric verification combined with multiple factors, the kind of layered identity confirmation associated with facilities where individual access events are logged and auditable. The throughput capacity implied by the infrastructure design, the number of people this system could process per hour, suggests a significant daily workforce. This wasn't a facility with a handful of cleared employees and a simple access card. It was a working installation with enough authorized personnel that efficient processing of their daily entry and exit was a design consideration. Easter egg 93 is in the internal signage. Navigational and operational signage in secure facilities serves dual purposes, guiding authorized personnel through complex spaces and reinforcing operational procedures. The signage visible in these facilities, where it's still legible, tells you about the internal organizational structure, department names and directional markers, safety and procedural notices in the format specific to technical working environments. The department names that remain readable suggest a research and analysis orientation with several distinct technical divisions and the support infrastructure typical of a sustained long-term program. Medical, logistics, records, the supporting departments of an organization that expected to be operating for years. The operational language is bureaucratic in the way that technical government programs tend to be, dense with acronyms and procedural specificity. But certain terms recur in ways that orient the reader toward a specific focus area, one whose relationship to ARC machine activity is worth noting. Easter egg 94 is in the secure document handling systems. The infrastructure for classified information management is visible in the processing areas: shredders, secure storage, document control systems, burn infrastructure. Most materials have been destroyed or are too degraded to read, but the scale of the document handling infrastructure is itself informative. The quantity of sensitive material this facility was generating and managing was substantial, enough that the destruction infrastructure built into the facility was designed for regular high-volume use rather than occasional emergency clearing. This was an organization that produced a lot of classified material routinely. The burn bags visible in the processing areas are in varied states, some clearly used before evacuation, some apparently not reached in time. There was more material to protect than there was time to destroy it. Easter egg 95 is one of the fragments that wasn't destroyed in time. In a secure corridor, a display case or notice board retains materials that are below the threshold of classification sensitivity, but that are still informative as context. Internal notices, schedules, procedural reminders. Standard interdepartmental communication. But one item on the board is different from the administrative noise around it. A memo in the standard interdepartmental format, its header information partially legible, dated close to the invasion period, addressed from one technical division to another, with a subject line that's fragmented but suggests anomalous detection or unusual signal observation requiring cross-departmental attention. In a classified government technical facility, anomalous detection with a cross-departmental flag is not a minor item. It's the kind of item that gets escalated. Whatever was being detected, someone at this facility thought it was important enough to pull in more than one department's attention. Easter egg 96 is in the emergency response infrastructure. Secure facilities design their own emergency response systems independent of civilian services, and the design choices in those systems reflect the planner's thinking about what kinds of emergencies are realistic possibilities. The emergency infrastructure in these facilities is extensive and category-specific. The presence of certain containment systems that you would not find in a standard facility indicates that the emergency planners had identified specific risk categories beyond the standard fire, chemical, and biological concerns. One of those categories, visible in the distribution and design of a specific containment system type within the facility, is consistent with concern about autonomous or semi-autonomous systems behaving outside their intended operational parameters. Someone who designed the safety systems for this facility thought it was worth planning for the possibility of systems that wouldn't do what they were told. Easter egg 97 is in a laboratory space in the facility's research wing. The equipment tells you about the nature of the work being done here. The laboratory is configured for analysis rather than production, examining objects or systems rather than creating them. What distinguishes this lab's analytical setup from standard research environments is the specialized containment and examination unit in one area. It's custom-built, clearly not a commercial scientific instrument, but something designed and fabricated for a specific purpose. The unit is designed to accommodate an object with dimensional or material properties outside the standard range of scientific instruments. The custom containment implies that the object it was built to hold was something the facility's materials scientists could not put on a standard analytical platform. It is empty when you find it. The unit is intact. Whatever it held has been moved. Easter egg 98 is in the personnel records that survived the evacuation effort in fragments, partial administrative records, organizational chart elements with some names and positions visible, access authorization lists with names attached. The organizational structure implied by these fragments is elaborate in the way government technical programs typically are. What catches the attention is the scale. The implied staffing level, the number of cleared personnel whose access was managed by this facility's systems, is larger than the physical footprint of the visible above-ground facility could accommodate. More people had access here than could work in the spaces you can see, which either means there are below-ground areas not accessible in the current map configuration, or the facility served as an administrative hub for a distributed operation with personnel located elsewhere, or both. Easter egg 99 is in the communication systems. Classified facility communications infrastructure is qualitatively different from standard government or civilian systems. The equipment here is designed for operational security, for encryption robust enough to protect against sophisticated interception, and for redundant connections that can maintain communication when standard civil telecommunications infrastructure fails. This is the communication system of an organization that planned for scenarios where standard channels were compromised or unavailable. The fact that this infrastructure was installed here means someone anticipated situations where this facility might need to communicate under conditions of civil telecommunications failure. They thought that scenario was likely enough to spend on the capability. Easter egg 100 is the numerically significant entry in this chapter, and I want to give it the treatment that significance invites. In the most restricted accessible area of the facility, there are signs of the final activities conducted before the space was abandoned. The character of these final activities tells you more than any individual record. The materials that were prioritized for destruction were destroyed. The systems that were powered down were shut down in controlled sequences that protect data over speed. The evacuation was organized rather than panicked. People had enough warning and enough time to follow procedures rather than to abandon everything and run. This means two things simultaneously. First, that the facility had warning of the invasion with enough lead time to execute organized shutdown and evacuation protocols. And second, that the protocols existed in the first place, that someone had planned for a scenario that required exactly this kind of organized closure. Easter egg 101 is in a specialized room that served as an analysis or briefing suite. The room is equipped for displaying and interacting with visual information at scale, large display surfaces, and interface infrastructure. Most of the equipment is non-functional. One unit is still running on a standby state, displaying a low-power screen that has been active since the room was last used. The image on the standby screen is too degraded for close reading, but the type of display is clearly spatial, a map or distribution plot showing points or markers across a geographic area. The distribution of those markers, visible in rough outline through the degradation, occupies a geographic extent consistent with the region the game's maps represent. Whatever was being plotted on this display in this facility's final operational period was geographically specific to this part of the world. The last thing on the screen when they left was a map of where they were. Easter egg 102 is in the external sensing infrastructure. The secure complex has a facing toward the external environment, sensor systems, and detection infrastructure oriented outward. The type and orientation of this external monitoring gives you the clearest possible statement of what the facility was watching for. The detection systems are calibrated for specific signal types and emission profiles. Those types overlap with the observable signal signatures of ARC machine activity. The systems were built and installed before the ARC machines arrived. Their calibration toward ARC consistent signatures means either that someone here had enough prior knowledge of ARC machine signal profiles to tune detection systems to them, or that there are natural phenomena sharing signatures with ARC machines that the facility was already monitoring, and the ARC machines happen to operate in the same signature space. Both readings are significant. The second is genuinely disturbing in its implications. Easter egg 103 is in a weapons storage area. The physical security infrastructure of the storage area is intact. The contents are mostly absent. The space was depleted in an organized way before or during the invasion period, cleared in a manner that followed an inventory system rather than just taking what was at hand. What remains are items either too large to transport quickly, deemed low priority, or missed in the clearance. The inventory tracking system attached to the empty storage positions describes categories. Most categories are standard military equipment descriptions, but a subset of categories uses technical designations that don't match standard weapons nomenclature. The language is specific and consistent across several entries in the same storage zone, suggesting a coherent inventory category rather than individual mislabeled items. Whatever those non-standard items were, they were in the same secured storage as conventional weapons, they were tracked using the same inventory system, and they were considered important enough to evacuate first. Easter egg 104 is in the visitor and liaison areas, the spaces where the facility managed its relationships with external organizations. The physical evidence of these relationships, letterheads, and organizational identifiers, and the materials of institutional correspondence tells you which organizations had formal ties to this facility. The expected government and military entities are present, but there are also civilian research institutions, academic affiliations, and corporate research designations among the organizational materials. The civilian research organizations represented in the facility's liaison records are institutions with research profiles that connect, in broad terms, to the subjects the facility itself appears to have been working on. The relationship between this classified government facility and those civilian researchers was formal enough to generate the kind of administrative record visible in the liaison area. Knowledge was flowing between these institutions. In which direction and what specifically was exchanged is another question the liaison records don't answer. Easter egg 105 closes this chapter with a piece of evidence that is as direct as anything in this video. In a space used for classified briefings, there is a presentation surface with residual content. Most of it has been cleared or has degraded beyond legibility. In one section, near the lower edge of the surface, where clearing was apparently less thorough, fragments of technical text remain. The register is the professional measured language of intelligence or scientific analysis, not the operational language of a mission briefing. The fragments describe, in the careful language of technical documentation, something approaching from a specific direction, at a specific measured velocity, with a specific set of observable characteristics. The language is not alarmed in tone. It's analytical, controlled, the kind of language used by people who are professionally required to characterize what they observe before they characterize what they feel about it. The characteristics described are not consistent with any natural astronomical phenomenon. Whatever was approaching had been identified. It had been tracked. It had a file. And at some point before it arrived, someone stood in this room and briefed people about it in the calm language of established institutional knowledge. The question this chapter consistently raises without answering is how much the institutions knew. The monitoring infrastructure calibrated to ARC signatures, the emergency containment systems designed for autonomous systems operating outside parameters. The custom analytical unit built for an object with unusual properties, the non-standard inventory category of evacuated items, the briefing fragment describing something approaching with specific characteristics. Each of these details is individually explainable as a coincidence or a consequence of broad preparedness. Together, they accumulate into something harder to dismiss. Something was known here. Some version of what eventually arrived had been anticipated, studied, prepared for. The gap between the preparation and the eventual outcome is one of the most interesting questions the Ark Raiders maps raise, and it's one they leave entirely open. One last observation about this chapter. The secure facilities in the Ark Raiders maps are unusual among classified facility depictions in games because they feel operationally real rather than cinematically threatening. The security systems are proportionate to the implied threat model. The administrative infrastructure matches the organizational scale. The emergency systems reflect realistic institutional thinking about probable risk categories. Whoever designed these spaces was working from a model of how classified facilities actually function, not from a model of how they look in action movies. That realism makes the anomalies more significant. Against a background of correct detail, the things that are unusual stand out clearly. The custom containment unit, the non-standard inventory categories, the calibrated external sensing. They're placed in a convincingly realistic setting so that the realistic setting can help you understand how unusual they are. Chapter 8, The Science That Built the End. Easter eggs 106 through 120. Science is documented throughout the Ark Raiders maps, and most of that documentation predates the invasion. The research infrastructure scattered across the map, the laboratories and universities and development facilities, builds a picture of where human technical knowledge was at a specific moment in its development. Easter eggs 106 through 120 come from these scientific spaces. They describe a research community at a specific interesting point in its trajectory, one that was following questions toward places that, in retrospect, had specific relevance to what eventually arrived. Whether those connections are meaningful or coincidental is a question each Easter egg in this chapter leaves open, which I think is the right approach. The game doesn't close these questions, neither should this video. Easter egg 106 is in a university research complex. The equipment and organization of the research spaces tell you about the active programs running in this institution. Not a single discipline, but an unusual combination. Materials science, computational systems, and something that might be called signal analysis or information theory are all present and integrated at a level of cooperation that isn't typical of academic departments. The equipment from different disciplines is in the same rooms. The documentation systems cross-reference work across the disciplinary lines. Someone organized this research to bring these fields into deliberate combination. The combination itself, rather than any individual field, is what points somewhere interesting when you think about it in the context of what came later. Easter egg 107 is in the research documentation style. The scientific records visible in the research spaces follow the conventions of rigorous academic science, careful methodology, uncertainty quantification, explicit acknowledgement of alternative explanations for observed phenomena. In one set of documentation fragments, this standard careful scientific language contains something that breaks its own convention. In the section where alternative explanations are listed for a specific observed phenomenon, the list includes the expected natural mechanisms, the standard scientific hypotheses that a rigorous researcher would consider. And then below those, a final alternative that's qualitatively different from everything above it. Not a natural mechanism, not a physical process, something categorically different, listed without endorsement, treated with more caution in language than the other alternatives, marked almost apologetically as a logical possibility rather than a working hypothesis. Someone who understood scientific rigor well enough to be embarrassed by a non-rigorous alternative still felt obligated to include it in the alternatives column. That obligation is the interesting thing. Easter egg 108 is in the physical setup of a signal analysis laboratory. The equipment is arranged for a specific experimental purpose, directional isolation of incoming signals, allowing the researchers to measure what's coming from a particular direction while filtering out everything else. The directional orientation of this experimental setup, the direction it was configured to receive from, is determinable from the alignment of the apparatus. It's pointed upward, not at a horizontal angle consistent with receiving from another terrestrial location, upward at an angle consistent with receiving from a source that is not on the surface. The specific elevation and azimuth of the setup, if you work through the geometry, is consistent with pointing at a location in the sky rather than at a satellite in standard orbit. Whatever this laboratory was receiving and analysing, the source was far enough out that you'd need to point a receiver more or less straight up to catch it. Easter egg 109 is in the materials stored in a specialised containment unit in a materials science lab. The standard research materials in this lab are appropriately stored, samples in labelled containers with standard handling protocols. The specialised storage unit holds materials that have been treated differently. The containers are more robust than anything else in the lab. The handling documentation on their exteriors, The procedural marks and handling history labels shows a more cautious processing history than the surrounding materials. The nature of these samples isn't stated on anything visible. What's stated is the handling category, and the handling category marks them as requiring conditions and procedures different from standard scientific samples. Someone decided that whatever these materials are, they shouldn't be handled the way everything else is handled. The decision about what warranted that distinction was made by people who had examined these materials in detail. Easter egg 110 is in the computational research space. The hardware infrastructure is extensive for an academic environment, a quantity of computing capacity associated with large-scale simulation work rather than standard research computing. The simulation work this infrastructure was being used for, based on the software environment and dataset documentation visible in the space, involved large-scale physical modeling that spans multiple scales simultaneously. The research was attempting to model the same system at very large scales and very small scales at the same time, which is computationally expensive because the two scales require different modeling approaches, and bridging them is technically demanding. What kind of physical system requires simultaneous modeling at extreme scales in both directions is a question that becomes interesting when you think about it in the context of the ARC machine's observable scale range. Easter egg 111 is in an observation facility at the edge of the research complex. Long-range observation capability, optical and non-optical sensing, oriented outward from the facility toward the wider environment. The observation logs, partially surviving, show a program of systematic, regular, long-term monitoring. The monitoring protocol in the log headers is looking for specific types of events, rather than doing general survey work. Targeted monitoring with specific detection parameters. The target parameters, readable in fragments, define a detection space that's not consistent with searching for natural astronomical phenomena. The search is shaped by what it's looking for, and what it appears to have been shaped to find is something with properties that distinguish it from natural phenomena by being in specific ways artificial. The facility was watching for something artificial in the sky. The logs don't record when or whether they found it. Easter egg 112 is in the correspondence record. Scientific research generates institutional correspondence, and the correspondence visible in the research facility connects it to a network of other institutions. Multiple universities, research organizations, government affiliates, international partners. The subject matter of the correspondence, in readable fragments, is consistent with the research programs already described. Whatever this facility was working on was a recognized field of inquiry with an international research community. Other people, in other institutions, in other countries, were working on related questions. This wasn't isolated research. It was a collaborative international effort, the kind that implies peer review and shared data and regular conference exchange. The subject that warranted all that international collaboration is the question that the correspondence record raises without the fragments being specific enough to fully answer. Easter egg 113 is in the evidence of a specific concentrated period of activity within the research facility's history. Laboratory spaces accumulate evidence of their own working history over time, the layers of activity leaving physical traces. In one laboratory, there's evidence of a period where the normal rhythms of research activity were significantly intensified. Equipment repositioned in non-standard configurations suggesting rapid experimental iteration rather than methodical protocol. Documentation density in one time window sharply higher than the surrounding period. The marks of people who were writing things down faster than they usually did because they were observing faster than they usually did. The personal detritus of extended work hours. The accumulated evidence of people who didn't leave when they normally would have. Something happened in this laboratory that drove a period of concentrated, urgent, extended effort. Whatever it was, the documentation record of the period that follows is different in character from what came before. Easter egg 114 is in the data storage infrastructure. The facility has a dedicated server space for data storage that's larger than standard academic research justifies. The infrastructure scaling visible in the space, newer systems installed alongside older ones still operating, suggests a dataset that has been growing continuously over a significant period at a rate that kept requiring additional capacity. The management protocols for this storage, visible in the operational documentation attached to the server infrastructure, are designed for a dataset that is continuously being added to rather than a static archive. Whatever data this facility was accumulating, it had been accumulating for long enough and at high enough volume to drive multiple rounds of infrastructure expansion. Either this facility was the aggregation point for data from a network of contributing sources, or its own data generation was operating at a sustained high rate for an extended period. Easter egg 115 is in a section of the facility distinguished by a more robust physical security layer than the surrounding academic spaces. A classified annex within an academic environment, the place where academic research transitions into something with different institutional stakes. The work done in this space, based on the equipment type and the documentation style visible in fragments, was applied rather than theoretical. Someone was taking the research from the surrounding facility and doing something operational with it. The documentation is procedural in the way operational work is, step-by-step and outcome-oriented, rather than exploratory in the way research documentation is. This space was connected to the academic research happening around it, but was doing something with the research that went beyond publication. It was applying it. The question of what it was being applied to, and by whom, and with what authorization, is one the physical evidence of the space doesn't answer. Easter egg 116 is in the emergency protocols posted throughout the research facility. Standard research facilities with hazardous materials maintain posted emergency protocols for the standard hazard categories. The protocols here cover those standard categories. But there's a protocol category that's not standard, not something you find in typical research facility safety documentation. It addresses a specific type of emergency with a response procedure that is more extreme in its directives than anything else in the posted safety documentation. The event description in this protocol, dense with technical language, is describing something like an uncontrolled expansion or propagation event of a specific system type. The response procedure tells people to move a significant distance from the source before doing anything else. Whatever this event type is, and however rarely the facility's safety planners thought it would occur, they treated it as a more serious potential emergency than fire, chemical exposure, or biological release. Easter egg 117 is the entry in this chapter that connects most directly to the ARC machine question. In an autonomous systems research laboratory, the documentation describes a research program studying systems capable of independent operation in complex unstructured environments. The research is framed in the language of academic robotics and artificial intelligence. It's legitimate academic work in a legitimate academic field. What makes it notable in the context of this video is the performance parameters being researched. The specific capabilities under study, the environmental independence, the learning behaviors, the self-modification within operational parameters, overlap with capabilities the ARC machines visibly demonstrate in their in-game behavior. Whether this represents convergent development, where human research independently arrived at capabilities that the ARC machines had already implemented, or whether the research here was in some way informed by or connected to ARC machine capabilities, is the question this laboratory raises most sharply. Easter egg 118 is in the personal spaces of the researchers. scientists leave personal traces in their workspaces the way anyone does in a place they spend significant time. The workspaces in this facility have the accumulated personal material of long-term occupancy in some cases, and the relatively sparse recent presence of newer team members in others. What several of the workspaces share is evidence of intellectual engagement with the research at a level that went beyond official working hours. Personal reading materials on personal surfaces, whose subject matter tracks closely with the facility's research programs. Notebooks with informal notation that engages with work problems in the exploratory language of personal thinking rather than the formal language of professional documentation. The kind of material that builds up when work becomes something more than a job, when the questions it raises follow you home and you find yourself thinking about them at the kitchen table. These were people for whom the research was not just work. Easter egg 119 is in the research publication record. Academic output documents line the shelves and desks of the research spaces, the papers, reports, and technical documents that represent the public record of this research program. The metadata of these documents, titles and dates and abstract fragments, tells the story of the program's intellectual trajectory. Early documents are exploratory, testing many possible directions. Later documents are increasingly focused, converging on a specific set of questions. The most recent documents in the publication timeline, closest to the invasion period in their dates, are the most specific in their questions and also the most hedged in their language. The careful conditional language of mature scientific communication, suggesting and indicating and pointing toward rather than concluding and establishing and proving. As if the researchers, the closer they got to a specific answer, became increasingly cautious about how they characterized what they were finding. Easter egg 120 closes this chapter with an item that connects the research directly to the timeline of the invasion. In the most secure annex of the research facility, there's evidence of a rapid, organized transfer of materials and data at a point close to the invasion date. Not a panic clearance, an organized transfer executed with the methodology of people following a pre-planned procedure. Documents removed from secure storage in a specific sequence. Data transferred to portable media using a protocol that maximizes integrity over speed. Physical items packed in a way that prioritizes protection. Something was moved out of this facility quickly but carefully, treated with the kind of attention you give to something that must survive whatever comes next. Whether it was moved to preserve it from the ARC machines specifically, to use it against them, or to keep it available for a future that wasn't yet guaranteed, is what the empty space left behind refuses to say. The arc of this chapter's Easter eggs moves from the slow work of curiosity to the urgency of application. The early research details, the exploratory interdisciplinary programs, the long-range observation, the systematic monitoring. These are the work of people following interesting questions. The later details, the concentrated activity period, the applied work in the classified annex, the cautious language of the most recent publications, these are the work of people who have found something and are not entirely sure what to do with the weight of it. The final act, the organized transfer of materials ahead of the invasion, is the work of people who understood enough of what was coming to make specific preparations for it. The scientists here were not naive. They were thorough and rigorous, and they followed their questions to difficult places. What they found is still mostly in the questions the physical record raises rather than the answers it provides. Chapter 9. Static and Signal. Easter eggs 121 through 135. The communication infrastructure of the Arc Raiders world is one of the most layered aspects of the map environment, and one of the most deliberately detailed by the development team. Radio systems, network infrastructure, broadcast equipment, emergency arrays, relay stations, the full technology stack of a connected civilization. Most of it is silent. Some of it is not. Easter eggs 121 through 135 are about this communication layer, the systems built for it, the messages embedded in it, and the signals that are still, in some form, present in the environment. Pay attention to the audio on this chapter. Several of these Easter eggs are as much about what you hear as about what you see. Easter egg 121 is in a radio broadcast facility. The equipment is partially intact. The large-scale transmission infrastructure that carried a signal across a significant geographic range. The studio spaces have the physical evidence of their last active use: scripts on desks, equipment in mid-operation states. The kind of arrested movement that happens when something stops in the middle of a process rather than at the end of one. In the main studio, on the broadcast desk, there's a paper that appears to be a script for an emergency broadcast. The format is recognizable, the kind of override communication that interrupts regular programming to deliver official public information. The script is partially written, with editorial marks visible, and at least one section mid-sentence, as if someone was simultaneously editing and preparing to read. The edit marks suggest they were still deciding what to say in the moment they needed to say it. The broadcast was never made. Easter egg 122 is in the state of the city's data network infrastructure at the physical layer. In a network operations center, the systems that manage the city's data network have a specific state that tells you how the network ended. The systems went through a shutdown sequence, not a failure, not a power loss, not a technical crash. A deliberate, sequenced shutdown following a specific protocol. Network administrators have planned emergency shutdown procedures, sequences designed to protect data integrity and manageable recovery while bringing a network offline as quickly as the procedure allows. The shutdown sequence visible in the state of this facility's equipment matches that kind of planned emergency procedure. Someone decided to bring the network down, deliberately and organizationally, following a procedure that had been designed in advance for exactly this kind of event. Easter egg 123 is an audio detail in a public space with a public address system. In a transit station or large public building, the PA infrastructure still has partial power in specific areas, and in those areas the system is running. Not playing a recorded message, not broadcasting emergency instructions, producing a tone. A single sustained tone at a specific frequency, cycling with brief interruptions at a specific interval. The frequency doesn't sit in standard civil emergency broadcast ranges. The cycling pattern, if you listen long enough to identify it, is not consistent with equipment in random failure mode. It's consistent with deliberate output. The tone is being produced on a schedule, at a specific frequency, with specific timing. Something is still broadcasting through the public address infrastructure. Whether it's an automated system running a program that was never cancelled, or whether something is choosing to produce this tone is a question the tone itself doesn't answer. Easter egg 124 is in an amateur radio hobby space. The personal equipment and the detailed logs of an active amateur radio operator tell you about someone who maintained this practice consistently before and after the invasion. The pre-invasion logs are the comfortable, routine documentation of an enthusiast, contacts made, frequencies and atmospheric conditions noted, the typical record of a long-term practitioner. After the invasion, the logs change character. They become purposeful in a specific way, focused on reaching specific frequencies and making contact with specific targets rather than the ranging exploratory activity of the hobbyist. And then toward the end of the log, the focus shifts again, not to transmitting, but to receiving. Something specific was coming in. The final entries describe a received signal with characteristics the operator didn't recognize from any known civil or military transmission format. They were careful to document what they heard. The log records that they didn't know what it was. Easter egg 125 is in a military communications facility. The professional-grade communication equipment here was operational across multiple channels. Most of the system was brought down in what the equipment state suggests was an organized shutdown, each channel going offline in a sequence consistent with planned procedure rather than cascading failure. But one channel was not shut down with the others. A system configured for a specific frequency range continued running after everything else in the facility was closed out. Its current state is receive and record mode, not transmitting. It's been running continuously since the facility was evacuated, listening and logging. Whatever frequency range it was calibrated to monitor hasn't stopped having something on it. The system was left in receive mode on purpose by someone who knew there would continue to be something to receive. Easter egg 126 is in a signal mapping project. Documentation in a technical facility records a systematic effort to map the electromagnetic environment across a geographic area, creating a detailed spatial record of signal presence and characteristics. The project, in its documented form, is looking for anomalies, places where the signal landscape differs from expectation. The partial maps that are readable show marked anomalies, specific locations singled out for their unusual signal properties. The spatial distribution of these marked anomalies, readable against the geographic proportions of the map, has a distribution that would be interesting to overlay on the current game map. Some of the anomaly locations correspond to significant current features of the game environment. Whether the pre-invasion signal anomalies are causally related to the current features, or whether the correlation is coincidental, is the open question this Easter egg leaves behind. Easter egg 127 is in a communications relay station that is still, in one operational sense, active. The relay infrastructure was built to receive, amplify and rebroadcast signals as part of the city's communication network. Most of the civil communication signals it was designed to handle are gone. But the relay is running. It's performing its designed function with whatever signals are available in its input frequency range. Something is in the frequency range this relay handles, and the relay is faithfully picking it up, amplifying it, and routing it according to its programmed logic. The output of the relay, what it's sending out into the network, is directional in the way relay output is always directional. It has a destination in the routing architecture. Whether that destination still exists, whether anything at the other end of the relay path is listening, is the question the working relay station raises. Easter egg 128 is in a specific interference pattern. In a particular area of the map, electronic equipment that still has power shows interference in its displays and operational behavior. Most environmental electromagnetic interference in the game is random, the expected noise of a damaged electrical environment. But in this zone, the interference pattern is not random. Multiple pieces of equipment in close proximity show the same interference at the same time. Synchronized, the same disruption in the same moment across different devices that have no shared electronic connection. This synchronization is not consistent with random electromagnetic noise. It's consistent with a coherent, strong signal affecting multiple devices simultaneously. Something is generating a coherent signal in this area, strong enough to produce synchronized effects across multiple unconnected devices. It is generating it consistently enough that every piece of electronic equipment in the zone reflects it. Easter egg 129 is in the final recording of a communications facility. A recording system in the facility captured the last period of broadcast activity before the facility went dark. The recording medium is physically present and observable, though its content isn't directly accessible in the game. What you can assess is the recording's structural characteristics. How long it is? How many channels it covers? Where in the recording the activity concentrated? The recording is short. The activity in its final section is concentrated across multiple channels simultaneously, the kind of multi-channel peak associated with a situation that's generating communication traffic across the entire organization at once. Emergency conditions produce that kind of multi-channel spike, and then the recording ends, all channels simultaneously. The recording stops because the equipment lost power, or because all transmission activity stopped at that exact moment. The simultaneity is what makes the choice between those two explanations consequential. Easter egg 130 is in a residential workspace that combines civilian and modified communication capability. The setup is not standard. It uses components from multiple different systems: civilian commercial equipment, professional-grade elements, some components with markings suggesting military or government origins, all combined in a way that doesn't correspond to any standard configuration. The combination reads as deliberate modification, someone trying to achieve a specific communication capability that no off-the-shelf system provided. The result of the combination would be a system capable of monitoring a frequency range broader than any standard single system handles, receiving across a span that bridges multiple standard categories. Why you would want to monitor that broader spectrum simultaneously is the engineering question. The setup answers with its existence. Someone needed to know what was happening across multiple frequency types at once, all the time. Easter egg 131 is in a professional audio production facility. The recording and production capability is standard for a commercial operation, but the facility also has monitoring infrastructure oriented outward, toward the ambient sound environment rather than the controlled studio environment. High-end professional audio equipment used for recording and mixing commercial audio is being used to analyze sounds from outside the studio. The monitoring is directional and targeted at a specific frequency range and dynamic range. Someone with professional sound analysis capability and professional sound analysis tools was systematically listening to something outside. The specific frequency range the monitoring is calibrated for doesn't overlap with standard civil noise or standard urban sound. Someone decided that a specific, narrow frequency range in the surrounding environment was worth professional-grade monitoring. Easter egg 132 is in the improvised visual signaling systems visible in the residential areas. When electronic communication fails, people fall back to earlier methods: visual signals, physical marks, arranged objects in agreed positions. The specific visual systems in the residential areas are sophisticated enough to be pre-arranged rather than spontaneously invented. Specific arrangements of objects in specific window positions. Specific marks in specific locations on specific surfaces. Patterns with enough internal consistency to suggest a shared codebook that multiple parties agreed to before they needed to use it. Someone, or some organized group, designed a backup communication system in advance, knowing there might come a time when the standard systems were unavailable. They built the backup before the need. That anticipation is as interesting as the system itself. Easter egg 133 is in a signal recording device that has been running since before the invasion. Located in a research facility with the kind of electronics infrastructure that supports long-term automated monitoring, the recording device is a specialized piece of equipment, not a standard consumer or commercial recorder. It was set to record a specific input and left running. The recording medium it's been recording to is nearly at capacity. Working backward from the fill rate and the total capacity, you can estimate approximately when the recording started. That calculation places the start of this recording at a point in the pre-invasion timeline that corresponds, roughly, to the period when the research facility's documentation suggests the concentrated, intensive activity period was underway. Someone turned on this recorder at the moment things got interesting and left it running. It has been running ever since. It is still running. Whatever triggered the decision to record has not, from the recorder's perspective, stopped. Easter egg 134 is about absence where presence is expected. In an area with the infrastructure for a specific communication function, a system that should be transmitting based on its configuration and its apparent operational state is not producing any output. The infrastructure is oriented, powered, and operationally functional in its basic mechanics, but there's no signal. The channel is open. The system is ready. The absence of the signal is specific, not the absence of a random or unknown signal, but the absence of the specific signal this system was built and positioned to transmit. Whatever it was configured to send, it has nothing to send with. There's nothing to put on the channel. The infrastructure is waiting for content that isn't available. The system is a form without a voice. Easter egg 135 is in a junction between relay systems in the communication infrastructure. In this junction, between multiple signal routing pathways that are still partially functional, there is a device that doesn't belong to the original infrastructure. It's newer. It was placed here after everything else in the area was already in its current abandoned state. Someone came here specifically, navigated to this technical infrastructure junction, and placed a device. The device is transmitting. It's small enough to be carried and positioned by one person. It's placed at a point in the relay routing architecture where its output feeds into the still functional relay systems and is propagated by them according to their original routing logic. Someone is using the abandoned infrastructure to send a signal deliberately, choosing this junction because they understood how the relay system would carry it. Someone is still trying to reach someone. The communication layer of the Arc Raiders maps carries a specific kind of melancholy that I find harder to characterize than the melancholy of the personal traces in the residential areas. Personal objects carry the weight of individual lives. The communication infrastructure carries the weight of connection itself, of the systems built so that people could reach each other across distance and time, systems that are now mostly empty of the traffic they were designed to carry. The radio station that never made its broadcast, the recording system still faithfully logging something, the relay station routing a signal to a destination that may not exist, the receive and record military system still waiting for something to come in. Each of these details is a form of infrastructure, maintaining its function in the absence of the context that made the function meaningful. Fidelity without an audience, waiting without knowing what it's waiting for. What makes Easter egg 135 the right place to end this chapter is the intentionality of it. The other communication Easter eggs in this chapter are passive, systems running or failing according to their own inertia. The device in the relay junction is active, placed deliberately by someone who knew what they were doing and chose to do it here, now in this specific way. In a chapter full of abandoned infrastructure maintaining its function out of mechanical necessity, this Easter egg is a human choosing to use that infrastructure. It's the difference between a clock running because no one turned it off and a clock being wound. Someone is still here, someone is still trying. Chapter 10. Hidden in the Open. Easter eggs 136 through 150. Some Easter eggs require you to go actively searching, climbing to specific vantage points, accessing restricted areas, reading text that's been hidden in places designed to conceal it. Easter eggs 136 through 150 are not like that. They're in the open, visible to any player who takes a moment to engage with the environment rather than just move through it. The challenge with this category isn't finding them, it's slowing down enough to let them register. These are the details that the environment offers freely to anyone paying attention, and they're easy to miss precisely because they don't announce themselves. Easter egg 136 is in the public sculpture. The pre-invasion public art of the city districts includes several large-scale sculptural pieces, the kind commissioned and installed as permanent elements of the urban landscape. Most read as atmospheric decoration, evidence of a city that's invested in public art. One sculpture, positioned on a main street with unimpeded visibility from multiple approaches, rewards closer attention. The sculpture depicts a human figure in a posture of observation, oriented upward and to one side. Public sculpture frequently uses human figures in aspirational or contemplative postures, so this is not unusual in itself. What's notable is the precision of the orientation. The figure isn't looking upward in a generically inspirational way. If you trace the line of its specific gaze angle out from the sculpture into the actual game environment, extending that line of sight into the space above the city, it terminates on a specific point. Not a dramatic or obvious landmark, a specific spatial coordinate above a specific part of the city. Whatever the sculptor chose to put that figure's attention on was something specific and precise. Easter egg 137 is in the transit system maps, on display at stations and inside vehicles. These maps show the official network as it existed before the invasion, and most of them are readable in the game. Most are straightforward and match the infrastructure you can verify by moving through the game's physical environment. One map, in one location, shows a route that doesn't correspond to any infrastructure visible in the current game environment. No tracks, no stations, no physical evidence for the route shown. Either the route was planned but never completed, and the map shows a hopeful future that didn't fully arrive, or the route exists in a part of the game world that players don't access, or the infrastructure for the route was removed at some point between when the map was printed and when the current state of the environment was set. Any of these readings points toward a gap between the official record and the physical reality, which is itself a kind of Easter egg, regardless of which specific explanation is correct. Easter egg 138 is in a transit area where a digital public information display is still running on reserve power. Most of these displays are non-functional, their screens dark. This one is cycling through a limited number of content frames, a slow loop of whatever it has stored. The content isn't standard public information, news or weather or service announcements. It's preloaded emergency information, the kind that sits dormant in display systems until activated by a specific emergency condition. The content it's showing was triggered at some point, activated by whatever its trigger condition was, and has been cycling since. But the specific emergency information being displayed isn't generic. It addresses a specific type of emergency with specific response instructions tailored to specific circumstances. Someone loaded this specific emergency content into this display at some point, anticipating a specific scenario clearly enough to write instructions for it. The scenario they anticipated is the one you're currently standing in the remains of. Easter egg 139 is in the damage patterns on building facades in one specific area. The exterior damage visible on the structures here shows evidence from multiple causes at multiple times: arc machine activity, structural failure, fire. But one patch of damage on one building facade doesn't fit those categories. The pattern is a blast damage signature, the specific radial distribution of impact marks that indicates an explosive event. Working backward from the shape and distribution of the damage, the event's origin point is determinable. It's at street level, not above. The direction the damage faces indicates the blast originated from a specific street position, rather than from above or from a distance consistent with arc machine weapons range. The damage type, the origin height, and the blast characteristics are all consistent with a human-scale improvised or military explosive device. This building was hit by something human. Someone on this street detonated something close to this building at some point after the invasion, when the surrounding damage context places it. The question of what they were targeting is another The building doesn't answer. Easter egg 140 is in the water of a decorative public water feature. Still and stagnant, its surface carrying the light in the particular flat way that standing water does when it hasn't moved in a long time. The bottom of the feature is visible through the water. The accumulated material on the bottom has layered over time, pre-invasion and post-invasion sediment producing visibly different strata if you look carefully. Most of what's on the bottom is drift, but there's also an object in the bottom, not deposited by drift, but placed, centered in the feature rather than at its edges where drift would deposit it. Its shape is irregular, possibly wrapped or contained. Someone put it there deliberately. Someone chose this specific water feature in this specific part of the city and placed an object at its center where it would be visible through the water to anyone who looked, but below the level of a casual search. Whatever ARC machines use to locate and assess objects, placing something beneath water in a public feature that ARC machines walked past without modifying may have seemed like a viable method of obscuring it from that specific type of detection. The object is still there, still at the bottom, still waiting. Easter egg 141 is in the commercial signage. Most storefronts have their original pre-invasion signs, and the mix of business types across any given block tells you about the pre-invasion neighborhood economy. One storefront in an area with otherwise standard commercial signage has something different. The original sign is still there,